Last time we took a look at Sonic the Comic's first 10 issues, how the comic established its lore and set the stage for great things to come, having introduced several STC-only characters and instigating Robotnik's reign over Planet Mobius. Today we're jumping ahead to the series' next major story arc, their adaptation of Sonic CD. This one story unfolds over the course of 8 issues, running from Sonic the Comic 21 through to 28, and at the time unprecedented length for the main Sonic strip. Okay, technically we have 3 stories here: Girl Trouble, Pirates of the Mystic Cave, and the Sonic Terminator, but for all intents and purposes, it's the comic's first epic singular tale. Another change is that, while previous issues kept switching artists and writers, this run is consistently written by Nigel Kitching and drawn by Richard Elson. In my opinion, these guys are the comic's dream team, so as a manga reader who has become used to seeing a consistent creator week to week, I was incredibly happy about this. While we're talking about the artwork, the widely available scans for this section of the story are of a noticeably lower quality than scans of other issues. So much so that I scanned pages from my personal collection for use in this video. Here are some examples of the difference that makes. Now, I can't do this for every video. For one, at the time of writing, I own around 90 of the comic's 223 issues, with massive gaps in the middle of storylines. For 2, scans of other arcs are of a significantly higher quality, reducing the benefit of scanning my own comics. Before we dive into Sonic the Comic's adaptation of Sonic CD, let's remind ourselves of the source material. Little Planet is said to be home to the Time Stones, which, shockingly, allow people to control, manipulate, and travel through time. Dr. Robotnik wants to get these gems so he can simultaneously rule over the past, present, and future. The planet only appears over Mobius for a short while, so the race is on between Sonic and the Mad Doctor. Also, Robotnik has a Sonic badnik called Metal Sonic, which kidnaps Amy Rose, a female hedgehog with a crush on our hero. You have a foot race with this foe, it's one of the most memorable boss fights in the entire franchise. Good times. The story was often secondary in 16-bit games, usually confined to the pages of the manual, so Nigel didn't have a lot to work with. Yet that also allowed him a lot of freedom. It will be interesting to see which elements of the games he kept, what got left out, and what he added into the mix. Kitching starts setting the stage in a story called Girl Trouble, which introduces the comics version of Amy. Her house is being raided due to her claims that she's Sonic's girlfriend, making her a target. Amy is shown wearing her in-game outfit, but unlike her Sonic CD sprite, her quills are spiked up. My guess is that Elson's reference material was likely this promotional image for Sonic CD, a look that's repeated in this image for Sonic Drift. I'm guessing this art is meant to give a sense of speed, like someone's hair reacting to the wind, but that wasn't made clear when the reference was handed over. That said, if my thinking is right, then I'm glad the mix-up happened. It helps give Amy a unique silhouette, distinguishing her from the rest of the cast, preventing her being read as just Pink Sonic, while the comic's later revisions to her wardrobe would define her even further. While we're talking character designs, something that I'm only now realizing is how much these troopers resemble the Archie Comics and SatAM SWAT bots. Hold on to that thought, because it's not the only minor realignment or similarity we'll see in this arc. And just because rule of 3, the opening 2 pages also see Johnny don his sick red leather jacket and metal quarterstaff for the first time, cementing his look for the series going forward. Like I said with Porker in the last video, I want one of those jackets. Sonic also does a quick change here, removing his Bob Beakey disguise. Richard cleverly places the reveal on a page turn, giving us a nice anticipation and payoff. Again, the man knows what he's doing. Johnny is a fan favourite character. Loyal, brave, and often the voice of reason. He might not have powers, but that doesn't stop him from leaping into the fray. Which is exactly what he and Sonic do here in order to rescue Amy. There is a slightly awkward panel here where Sonic is moving right while facing left. We sort of have to follow Sonic's line of sight to a trooper, with the trooper's hand and speech balloon pushing us up into a cannon that's pointing directly into the final panel. You can see the letterer, Ellie DeVille, having to work around it so that the trooper still speaks first. It kind of technically works, but it feels a tad stiff. I don't know how to fix this without redrawing the panel in a top-down orthographic view to place the trooper in the top corner with Sonic approaching from the bottom corner. A really nice touch is that when the troopers fire this weapon, which misses Sonic and Johnny, our blue blur immediately prioritizes the innocent bystanders that it could hurt instead, saving a kid's life. I keep coming back to this point in these videos, but as much as this iteration of Sonic is a cocky, arrogant teenager, he's also a hero. He's brash, but his priorities are in the right place. He's not a Boy Scout paragon of virtue, and that makes him a much more interesting character to read. Equally, choosing to save the civilians means that Sonic fails to rescue Amy. I know modern games, comics, etc. have certain mandates from Sega, but something I really appreciate when revisiting this series is that Sonic can lose. He can have minor and major setbacks. We don't know that he's always going to succeed. Page 4 of this story is actually quite important to the comic's history, establishing two big changes to the status quo. After a great establishing shot showing us Robotnik's base in the Special Zone, two stylists tell Robotnik that he needs a new look. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this panel as it uses theatre staging. In a stage play, characters tend to face forwards, even if they're talking to people who are behind them in the scene, so that the static, immovable audience can still see them, but more importantly, hear them too. You have a single front-on perspective to work with for the entire production, and you'll often see characters walk forwards and chat side by side to account for this problem. This panel employs the same trick, but it doesn't have to. Comics can move the camera or viewpoint to wherever it's needed. In this case, redrawing the panel like this not only fixes the problem, but can actually enhance the following panel where the designers flee by implying their travel through a physical space. Like I said in my previous video, Elson is among my favourite artists in any medium. However, that doesn't prevent me from spotting opportunities for improvement. I will praise Kitching for the humour here. The people, they just don't like you, man. I'm a merciless, power-crazed dictator, you idiots! I don't care whether the people like me or not! A great example of why this self-aware, self-absorbed, callous Robotnik is quite possibly my favourite depiction of the character. Strangely, Robotnik does take their advice, cocooning himself into an egg, which his assistant Grimer discovers. This is our first introduction to Grimer. You can think of him as a slightly more competent and sinister Snively, Robotnik's right-hand man who has more agency over the grander plot than you might initially think. If you've seen my video on issue 100, you already know that Grimer is the sole reason Robotnik escapes his eventual capture. We will definitely be coming back to this guy. I'm going to skim over this whole Robotnik cocooning himself into an egg thing for now. We'll discuss it more when Robotnik shortly emerges from it, but yeah, apparently this is a thing that he can do. Not much happens on page 5. Sonic launches a rescue mission with Johnny. The only thing I will point out is that the speech balloons in this panel are in the wrong order, and it's a messy read that takes me out of the book every time. You could maybe fix it without needing to flip or redo the art, so I am putting this one on the letterer Ellie DeVille. We're now in the special zone to take the fight to Robotnik. Johnny asks Sonic if they should stop and come up with a plan first. Sonic says no, barrels on into the base, and is immediately captured just as Robotnik's egg cocoon starts to, hatch? I think hatch is the most appropriate word here. Now, there are a couple of ways to read these events. You could say Sonic is being the brash, cocky teenager I talked about earlier. You could point to his flawed character and the fact that rushing in head first would get him into trouble many more times during the comic's run. He's too impulsive and takes too many risks. Or you could be an absolute simp like me and say he's actually putting more thought into this than he lets on. He travels light, taking just Johnny and not the full crew to minimize risk. He knows where Amy is and who has her. Given how trigger-happy Robotnik's been to mechanize his friends in the past, he feels a sense of urgency. There isn't time to stop and make a plan. He needs to get to Amy now. It also shows he cares about her safety and well-being, at least far more than he will ever let on. A later issue in this arc will reinforce my defense of Sonic's actions here, or at least show growth in the character. I would be interested to hear your take on this one in the comments though. I also love the tension of this final page. Sonic and Johnny are captured by Grimer as we zoom in on smoke pouring out of Robotnik's room, with sharp cuts to the egg as it begins to crack. It's got a sense of dread to it. Something sinister is coming. You could imagine pairing Jaws music to it, and as a kid, the next fortnight until the next issue felt like an agonizingly long wait. This is how you do a cliffhanger. It's a shame the reveal is a bit of a letdown then. Issue 22. From the cover alone, I knew what was coming. I recognized those gloves, and I got nervous. We get a repeat of the zoom-ins on the cracking egg cocoon, building anticipation, but what emerges is the adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog Robotnik. Now, while he claims his new form will make him, quote, more powerful, more deadly, more rotten than ever, there was a real concern that the character would become as comedic, slapstick, and incompetent as his cartoon counterpart. While there is certainly a degree of that in this story, and don't worry, we will get to it, the comic's staff, especially Richard, would tweak this design over the years and make it their own. He would somehow become more menacing, threatening, and intimidating, taking great advantage of his large and imposing frame. As for why this transformation has taken place, I couldn't find any official word on it. I can only assume that this change was a mandate from Sega, as the Adventures design of Robotnik featured prominently here in Europe. He starred in Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine. What few toys we got were based on this take on the character. He appeared on some of our game covers, and he was featured in other books, including this oddity that features Game Sonic, Adventures Robotnik, and Sat AM Sally. For better or worse, this was our Robotnik. Sega seemingly wanted brand synergy for our territory, and I wouldn't be surprised if the writer, Nigel Kitching, was simply told, "This needs to happen, find a way to make it work." Earlier, I commented on how the troopers reminded me of the SWAT bots. When I look at Adventures Robotnik side by side with the SatAM, Early Archie, and Underground Robotnik, I also see a lot of similarities. It feels like they share a base design, with one diverging to focus on laughs, while the other is a more sinister take. I don't feel like they're worlds apart. Back to the comic at hand, the phenomenal artwork from Elson continues as we see Sonic, Johnny, and Amy being held captive by Grimer. There's a great little exchange here where Sonic truthfully tells Grimer that Amy isn't his girlfriend, but Grimer doesn't buy it. He thinks it's a ploy to get him to let Amy go, leaving Sonic exasperated. Also worth highlighting on this page is the introduction of a peach colour to the pink bubble that Sonic is trapped in. It implies his prison is translucent, while giving it a nice, almost luminous glow. Just some expert rendering on display that really helps to define the material. It's not long before Robotnik makes his entrance and orders Amy to be turned into a Super Badnik, prompting Sonic to act. This is where the slapstick starts to come into play to a degree. Sonic is treating his confines as a bowling ball, while Robotnik seems flustered. The Doctor is unable to come up with anything beyond a simple "Get them!" A trooper then fires at Sonic and Johnny against Grimer's advice, freeing them through sheer incompetence and lack of foresight. The whole page is very Saturday morning cartoon and goes against the tone of the majority of the book. Thankfully, sequences like this will become the exception rather than the rule. Now there's a lot that I want to say here. First, let's look at that Super Badnik design. This strongly reminds me of the Mecha Sonic we see at the end of Sonic 2. It's the same colour, it has those sharp, almost low poly edges, and it just has a much more industrial feel to it. It's kind of weird seeing this clunkier hardware so soon before the reveal of Metal Sonic, which is a much sleeker, more streamlined and refined design. I always felt like Sonic 2's Mecha Sonic was the prototype, while Metal Sonic was the production model. Origins proves me wrong, even if I dislike that fact, but that's another topic for another video. Second up is one of those things that no one other than me cares about. We see this really glossy finish to Amy's eyes. It's a technique we'll see repeated throughout this arc, and oh man, I just love how it looks. I even tried to emulate it when I drew the thumbnail for my recent Shadow the Hedgehog review. It helps the eyes look reflective, showing the, at the risk of sounding gross, surface fluid of the eye. It's not a hard, flat surface, and this shading really sells that fact. Finally, we have Sonic's momentary hesitation before saving Amy. Sonic's actions in this issue imply that, despite being captured, he still feels in control. We don't see him panic, and the moment things get serious, with the troopers turning Amy into a Badnik, Sonic leaps straight into action. He's got a self-assured smirk on his face pretty much the entire time, just brimming with confidence. If he is worried at any point during this story, he's hiding it very well. Sadly, this is followed by some more slapstick. Sonic escapes while Grimer is smashing the last remaining trooper for ignoring his order not to shoot. I do like the line, "I got a little carried away." Carried away? Carried away? When I'm finished with you, you'll need to be carried away! But the tonal shift in this story has served to make the primary antagonist seem less competent and therefore less of a serious threat. Again, that won't stick, they will reverse course, but it is a knock against this particular issue. We wrap up with Amy joining the Freedom Fighters, as she's now a target for Robotnik. Again, we get a nice exchange. "You are not my girlfriend." Not yet, anyway. This is years before Sonic Adventures. I'll make that Sonic respect me, and I love to see that determination here. But that's not all. We end with a teasing silhouette of Metal Sonic, named Metallix or Metallix? Not sure on the pronunciation, even now. As for the comic giving Metal Sonic a unique name, there have been a few different stories, but in a panel at Western Supersonic, Nigel Kitching attributed the name to the editor at the time, Richard Burton. Kitching told the crowd he came up with the name Metallico, which Burton rejected, instead suggesting Metallix. I like it. It sounds menacing, it suits the character. It's less on the nose and more imaginative than simply Metal Sonic. In fact, when I reviewed Sonic CD, I kept writing Metallix in the script and had to consciously use Find and Replace to swap all mentions out for Metal Sonic. Even then, I had to re-record my voiceover lines several times because I kept saying Metallix. Before we get to see more of Metallix though, we have the Pirates of the Mystic Cave. I did consider skipping this story, but it has links, albeit tenuous, to the wider arc, and I decided to include it. Amy has been kidnapped. Again. Something that even the comic itself comments on. It happens between issues, with Johnny telling us that she was protecting Tails. I spoke before about the comic rule of show, don't tell, and this issue always feels jarring to me in that respect. I always feel like I've missed part of the story and have to reassure myself that I haven't. The comic would soon start featuring Sonic-centered backup stories, as comics based on other Sega properties like Shinobi would be very slowly phased out. If that transition had started just a few issues earlier, then maybe they could have used one of those spots to show Amy being kidnapped. As it stands, it always feels like there's a mysterious lost chapter. As always, the artwork is on point, with no complaints from me. There is still some humour that doesn't land for me, like Tails being made to walk the plank before Sonic reminds him that he can fly. Or the ghost Filch confirming that he was murdered by Captain Plunder for taking an extra biscuit. That's kind of dark. Oh yeah, this issue introduces Captain Plunder, an original character we will see more of, and his band of pirates. They want the Chaos Emeralds, which of course Sonic isn't going to hand over. Amy is supposedly redeemed in this story by freeing herself with her smarts. She suggests that Sonic and Plunder join forces. Sonic will tell Plunder which of Robotnik's freighters are worth robbing, and Plunder's crew will provide backup to the Freedom Fighters when they need extra muscle. After Sonic's crew leave, the issue ends with Plunder telling Filch the Ghost that he still has his eyes on those Chaos Emeralds though. Again, I don't have much to say here. It's nice to see a location from Sonic 2, I guess, but I also couldn't skip this issue for reasons you will see shortly. Wearing its influences on its sleeve, we finally start the Sonic Terminator, Part 1. We open with Sonic seemingly being taken out by a mysterious silhouette. The figure then finishes off Sonic, which is revealed to be a robot, as Robotnik and Grimer confirmed that they're ready to launch Operation Terminate Sonic. I love that we still don't get to see Metallix yet. It adds mystery and tension, especially as very few people had a Mega CD and a copy of the game at the time. The build-up has been great so far. I do have questions though. If Robotnik can make a Sonic replica, why doesn't he use it? Imagine the confusion and reputational damage that Robotnik could cause by having a robot that looks just like Sonic cause havoc. The Doctor could frame our hero for anything, yet he just uses this as a disposable test dummy? Switching to the real Sonic, Robotnik's forces are targeting the Emerald Hill folk again. Sonic leaps into action, with Johnny again noting Sonic doesn't have a plan. Sonic takes out one trooper, but rushing in causes the freedom fighters to be surrounded, forcing their surrender. Johnny is quick to criticize Sonic for his actions again. Personally, I would have put the surrounded reveal on the page turn. By moving the top panel of page 4 to the bottom of page 3, we could make a greater contrast between the team's confidence and their quick surprise defeat. I'm surprised Elson didn't go for this, as his layouts are usually highly considerate of the reader experience, and his pacing is typically best in class. As Sonic boards the prison ship, we meet one of Robotnik's commanders. I think this might be the first time we see an organic in Robotnik's army. Bar Grimer, of course. It makes sense that some people would rather side with Robotnik than fight him. Just look at the UK's current political landscape. Being a bore, this guy is also a literal gammon, which makes me chuckle as an adult. Sonic casually tells the commander to look behind him, revealing a pirate ship in pursuit. Plunder's crew boards the ship, starting a brawl as Johnny realizes that Sonic did have a plan after all. Again, a nice little character moment that calls back to Girl Trouble Part 1. It's these little touches that make me really appreciate Kitching's ability as a writer. There's a blink and you'll miss it first appearance of Amy using her signature weapon, a crossbow, in combat here. It's such a small detail that for years I thought the first instance of her using it was in the next issue. Regrettably, Porker accidentally tells Filch where the Chaos Emeralds are hidden on South Island, causing the pirates to set course for their hiding place. Now you see why we couldn't skip the previous issue. Part 2 opens with two mistakes in my mind. It states that both Green Hill Zone and Emerald Hill Zone are on South Island. In game canon, we know that Emerald Hill is on West Side Island, not South Island. Game canon also tells us that South Island drifts around, changing locations, and does not appear on any maps. So even if the pirates know that the emeralds are on South Island, they might not know where South Island is right now, making that knowledge useless to them. Of course, the obvious answer to this is that this isn't the game universe or canon. This is a separate lore and continuity. If they want to say South Island is static and that both Green and Emerald Hill are based there, that's absolutely okay. Of course, Sonic and the gang quickly arrive, and I really like this fight. Sonic uses his head, breaking stalactites to trap the pirates. Meanwhile, we see Amy using her crossbow to disarm opponents, even saving Porker. This is a massive step up from her portrayal as a damsel in distress. It's a shame that we would soon see a regression on that front. Plunder grabs and threatens Tails again. Emphasis on the again, causing Sonic to hand over the emeralds. This is another example of some of the repetition we see in this broader story. Tails has been captured twice, Amy will be kidnapped a total of 3 times, Sonic and the pirates fight each other in caves twice. It just seems really inefficient. During this arc, I had been wondering what materials Elson was using in his artwork. The fairly consistent line widths and the way it responds to bumps and grooves in the paper implies the inking is done with fine liners, but I couldn't place the colours. The saturation and vibrancy suggested alcohol-based markers, such as Copics, but some of the blending, smooth gradients, and ways some colours have unintentionally bled into each other suggested an ink or paint. These 3 dots in this panel confirms that the alcohol-based markers form at least part of his workflow. Markers typically have 2 ends, a brush tip and a chisel tip. If you keep the marker on the paper for too long at the end of the stroke, the paper soaks up more of the ink, and you end up with a darker, more defined point, which we see 3 instances of here. Now, it's entirely possible that Elson is still using mixed media. For example, markers for characters and effects, watercolors or ink washes for the backgrounds. But it's certainly possible to blend and create gradients with higher end markers and a level of skill and experience Elson clearly has. My unnecessary arts lecture aside, Sonic of course chases after the pirates to retrieve the emeralds and the pirates just casually hand them over. The emeralds absorb evil energy, so they mellow the pirates out. That's a neat idea, but is also a little anticlimactic and makes Plunder's contribution to this arc rather minimal. Out of 8 issues, 3 are dedicated to this side story, and it just doesn't really contribute anything. It feels like watching the Bleach anime, where filler arcs are weaved into canon arcs. It certainly gave me a bad first impression of the pirates. Meanwhile, back at the Emerald Hill Zone, the residents are being attacked as we finally get our full-page reveal of Metallix. This is, without a doubt, one of the comic's most memorable pages, even if the posing feels a little goofy to me. I could easily imagine some of you having this page as an A2 poster. As a tidbit, Kitching would later admit that Metallix's use of Exterminate was an unconscious nod to the Daleks from Doctor Who. Once he came to the realization, he decided to run with it instead of hiding from it, and that the comparison did influence future stories featuring the robot. On to part 3, which opens with this adorable shot of Sonic playing a Mario parody on a Mega Drive Model 2 at his secret base. I just adore this. The guys get a video call from Amy saying she's been kidnapped yet again and is at Never Lake. As expected, Sonic wastes no time in rushing to Never Lake, where he discovers the terraformed Little Planet, or Miracle Planet as it's known in this comic. He also encounters Amy, and of course, Metallix. Obviously, Amy was just bait to lure Sonic out, but this causes a disconnect with the ending of the previous issue. You would expect Metallix attacking the Emerald Hill Zone would have drawn Sonic's attention. We have twice seen Sonic come to the Emerald Hill's rescue in this very storyline, but this time he's just chilling out playing video games? There's no way the team wouldn't have at least heard about Metallix's raid. As it stands, we have to assume that Metallix expected to find Sonic in Emerald Hill and, when Sonic didn't show, kidnapped Amy as a plan B. This aligns the comic with the game's plot, sure, but what does it mean for the Emerald Hill folk? Anyway, it's time for Sonic and Metallix to throw hands. This opening gambit is one of my favourite pages in the comic's entire run. The way this is drawn and paced shows a great back and forth between the two combatants, with Sonic leaping and running across the rocks Metallix is throwing. The camera keeps zooming in on Metal, as if we're seeing the gap being closed from Sonic's point of view. It also reminds me of how Sonic leaps across and destroys falling boulders in Sonic CD's opening cutscene. Sadly, Sonic ends up being splattered. Big oof. Elson has used speed lines before, but this page is perhaps the most prominent application of them yet. That and the general pacing strongly reminded me of battles in shonen manga like Dragon Ball. So I reached out to Elson to see if that had been an influence. In another example of how whoever said never meet your heroes clearly did not have Elson and Kitching as their heroes, Elson quickly responded to me, confirming that manga had been a conscious influence at the time, even listing Akira, Nausicaa, and Lone Wolf and Cub as some of the manga he was actively reading during that period. Again, Richard is one of the nicest and most down-to-earth people that you could ever hope to meet. Sonic burrows through the slab that hit him, scoring a hit on Metallix. Amy stands by watching the battle unfold, commenting that they're moving too fast for her to even keep track of the fight. Again, Dragon Ball called. As the dust settles, Sonic's silhouette approaches Amy, but surprise! It's Metallix. As he comes to terminate her, he falls down as, surprise again! Sonic wobbles over, somehow still standing. However, just when it looks like it's over, surprise again! Metallix gets in a cheap shot from behind and retreats to Miracle Planet with his, quote, live bait. I love this thing's matter-of-fact dialogue. Sonic's backup arrives at Never Lake just in time to see the Miracle Planet disappear, as Porker comments that it only shows up once every month. More nice tension building. We now know that Sonic and Amy are alone with an enemy that just fought our hero to a standstill. Worse still, help isn't coming. I enjoy the attention to detail in having the Miracle Planet chained to Robotnik's face, just as it is in CD's opening. It's not something that they had to do, but I'm glad Elson chose to. Sonic looks out across the metallic Miracle Planet in a pose we've seen recycled a lot during this particular run. We've seen it while checking in with Kintabor, looking out at the Emerald Hill Zone, negotiating with Plunder, on the very next page while surveying the pirate ship, and again now. Fortunately, as the comic would go on, Richard would come to rely on this pose and shot composition less and less, long before it could become seen as a habitual go-to comfort. Amy joins him as Metallix bleeds out of the wall like a goddamn T-1000. It's not that surprising, given that the story is literally called the Sonic Terminator, but damn, this is a creepy ability. This is brilliantly split across 4 portrait panels, cropping in gradually in a creepy, horror movie-esque "it's behind you!" before Metallix fires a cheap surprise shot. Check out Sonic's expression here. He looks like an annoyed New Yorker going, "Hey, I'm walking here!" Sonic seems to run away before striking Metallix from behind. When Amy asks how, he responds, "Planets around, girl." Yeah, this enemy requires so much effort to defeat that Sonic's willing to do a lap of an entire planet just to score a single strike on it. And people thought this series didn't take on shonen influences until the Dreamcast era. We get some awesome Palpatine-like lightning as Richard overlays what I'm assuming is white acrylics over Metallix's eyes to accentuate his sheer raw power. Metallix confirms that, while he was on a limited battery during their fight on Mobius, the Miracle Planet supplies the robot with unlimited power. In other words, he can go all out without having to conserve energy. And this is where things get weird. A smaller Sonic strikes Metallix, claims to be from the future, shoves Sonic into a shrink ray, and hands him a time stone. I'll admit, it's cool to see 2 more game elements, one of the stones and the shrink ray, being used in the comic. I do have some issues with the time travel at play here, but I'm going to put a pin in that for the moment. The 2 Sonics don't have much time to chat as Metallix gets back on his feet, now at 100% power and twice their physical size. The next issue picks up from that exact moment and, oh my word, the artwork in this panel is stunning! The overlaid lightning effects, the blending of teal into Metallix's usually blue finish. It really gives this guy a powerful glow, draws your eyes to the mech, and clearly positions it as a massive, immediate threat. Unfortunately, the same page describes one of my biggest issues with the time travel plot. Before I continue, I am not a fan of time travel in general, and by and large, I've never been a sci-fi guy. I just can't get into Doctor Who, Stargate Atlantis, Sliders, etc., and that will become a big problem for me later on in the comics run. Sonic asks his future self, "What am I supposed to do?" And the response is, "You'll figure it out, I did." In linear time travel plots, the mere existence of Sonic's future self guarantees that our present Sonic will succeed. As the reader, my investment has to switch from "Will Sonic succeed?" Again, this comic has not been afraid to show him lose or fail, to "How will Sonic succeed?" To me, how is far less engaging than if. In the past, Sonic comes across a machine that is terraforming the planet, possibly a nod to the game's badnik generators that you need to find and destroy in order to create good futures. Our blue boy is able to venture inside thanks to his shrunken size. The aesthetic of not only this machine, but the terraformed Miracle Planet does remind me of Metallic Madness, Sonic CD's final stage, an idea that's strengthened by the fact that Madness is also the only level the Shrink Ray appears in. It's clear that Kitching and Elson either made the effort of playing Sonic CD or were given extensive reference materials. Inside, Sonic finds and removes the Time Stone, destroying the machine and allowing him to travel back to the future, completing the time loop. We even get a repeat of the exact same page from the last issue. In comics, that refers to repeating a single panel multiple times, sometimes with minor changes. Repeating an entire page, though? That might be the most extreme example of it that I have ever seen, outside of this one 4-4 breaking gag in Dragon Ball, where Toriyama tells his editor that he doesn't need to be paid for duplicate pages. In case you couldn't tell from the multiple references to it, I like Dragon Ball. The two Sonics repeat the same "you'll figure it out, I did" exchange, albeit with new artwork from different viewpoints, as our Sonic wonders why nothing has changed. That's answered on the very next page as the planet returns to its natural beauty. Sonic regrows to his original size, and Metallix disappears because, quote, "You, chum, were never built." I have multiple issues with this conclusion, and I'm not alone in that. We know that time travel exists in this universe. The Omniviewer had previously sent Sonic and friends 6 months into the future. We also know that time travel will feature again in future stories. The comic appears to use linear time travel. There is one timeline, and actions in the past directly change the future. In a sense, the Sonic Amy's with at the end of the story is not the Sonic she arrived with. Her Sonic goes back in time, while the to her future Sonic is the one that sticks around. There appears to be a lag in past events altering the future, and everyone seems to retain their memories of the original timeline. Does this mean that everyone also gets an alternative set of memories of the things that they would have done instead in the new timeline? For example, Sonic and Amy only came to Miracle Planet because Metallix kidnapped Amy. If Metallix was never built, then Amy was never brought here, and the two would have experienced different life events instead. Do they now have memories of those alternate events? Actually, if the planet is now back to its natural state, Sonic's back to his original height, and Metallix has disappeared because the terraforming machine blew up, why are Sonic and Amy still trapped on Miracle Planet for a month? Shouldn't they be teleported back to Mobius because, again, if Metallix never existed, they would have never come here? And how does the terraformer getting destroyed erase Metallix? Yes, Metallix could absorb infinite energy from the terraformed Miracle Planet, but he could also operate independently via a battery as seen during his attack on Emerald Hill and his battle with Sonic at Nether Lake. This Robotnik has already built 2 Metal Sonics in this comic, 2 Metal Tails variants, and we even saw a Metal Amy in this very storyline. The terraformed Miracle Planet was clearly designed to augment and support Metallix, so we can assume that, at the time the terraformer was built, Metallix's schematics had already been drawn up. I doubt Robotnik would abandon the project due to that one relatively minor setback. Furthermore, Metallix would reappear in mass-produced numbers later on. These would be the same design and specification. With knowledge of future arcs, we also know that Metallix can severely and significantly tamper with the timeline, knowing that he will still be built anyway. I'll save the specifics so as to not spoil a future Brotherhood of Metallix video, but suffice to say, Metallix vanishing just doesn't make sense. During that Western Supersonic panel, Richard Elson even challenged the time travel logic of this story, and Nigel Kitching couldn't give him a satisfactory answer. Referring back to my video on issue 100 again, I criticised Kitching for writing himself into a corner. He built up an enemy that was too powerful for the heroes to believably overcome, and he had to Deus Ex Machina his way out of that hole, which was ultimately not very satisfying for the reader. This is a much earlier example of that, with the ending feeling rushed overall. You could also argue that you only need to read 3 issues of this 8-part plotline, those being the Sonic Terminator parts 3, 4, and 5, which actually cover the events of CD. Even if you keep in Girl Trouble for Amy's introduction, you could write Captain Plunder, who is ultimately inconsequential to these events, out of this story and reduce this arc from 8 parts down to just 5. This would also reduce the number of times Amy is kidnapped from 3 to 2, which is arguably still one too many, especially as Girl Trouble ends with Amy joining the Freedom Fighters specifically for her own safety because she's become a target for Sonic's enemies. Yeah, good job guys, you kept her real safe, well done. For as much as I just bashed the story, I do enjoy it. Considering this is a fortnightly comic, these events originally played out over the course of 16 weeks, or 4 months of real time. It was the series' first serious epic, and it really did feel that way at the time. We finally had meaningful continuity. Amy joined the team, Grimer debuted, Robotnik got his new look, Wonder was introduced, and of course, we had Metallix itself. The book celebrated its first birthday during this run, and it's crazy to think how far it had come in that time. The status quo and direction had completely changed. Sonic the Comic was no longer a series of largely disconnected one-shots. It now had a much stronger sense of identity. While I do think it's weird that Metallix didn't appear on a single one of the covers during this period, I think he would have helped sell more copies, this story did cement Sonic the Comic as being a great read and something to keep coming back to every single fortnight. And the comic would keep going from strength to strength, with issues 33 to 38 loosely adapting Sonic 3, followed by issues 45 and then 47 through to 53 taking on the and Knuckles portion of the story. That will be the focus of my next Sonic the Comic video, so look forward to that in the hopefully near future. In all seriousness, these videos take a very long time to write, record, and edit, so thank you for watching to the end. I would love to hear your thoughts on this arc. Did you grow up with the comic? Are you an American who is curious about what us Brits got instead of Archie? Let me know, I love chatting with fellow Sonic fans.